Hi, I'm Dave Champion, candidate for Nye County Sheriff. There's been some controversy over my statement that I have a law enforcement background, so I thought we'd spend a few minutes exploring the issue together today. In the 1990s, I owned and operated a company that provided privatized law enforcement services in low-income, high-crime areas throughout Southern California. A less politically correct way to say that is my officers and I worked exclusively in the poorest neighborhoods that are home to gangs like the Crips, the Bloods, Mexican Mafia, MS-13, White Fence, and many, many more. Some folks are apparently wrapped around the axle over the distinction between private law enforcement and public law enforcement. In this video, we're going to look at the similarities and differences between the two. But before we do that, as a baseline, let's take a look at some public law enforcement officer footage from the 90s.
Okay, see? Okay. The answer is no. No. Okay. Maybe at your toes, because apparently they already got a domestic. Okay, you got two choices. You leave with me now, or you go to jail.
Pretty straightforward, right? Two quick notes before we get going. First, this presentation is broken down into 4 parts: the job, training, miscellaneous, and conclusions. Second, what follows pertains exclusively to my operation and my officers. Admittedly, what we offered was likely the pinnacle of privatized law enforcement, but since we're talking about my candidacy, my operation is all that's relevant. One more important note: make sure to stay with me and keep watching all the way to the end, because near the end I'm going to reveal a huge distinction that requires private law enforcement to perform to a much higher standard of compliance with the law and respect for personal rights than public law enforcement. As always, I never tell folks what to think. That's not my place. I provide the facts, you're the judge. What is the job of law enforcement? But more to the point of this video, what are the similarities and differences between public and private law enforcement? As we run through the services law enforcement provides, each will be accompanied by a graphic showing the private law enforcement on the left and public law enforcement on the right, with a green check or a red X under each as appropriate. Let's begin. Respond to calls for service. Takes reports of crimes committed, past tense. Respond to misdemeanors and felonies in progress. Makes arrests for crimes ranging from petty theft to murder. Use of force when necessary. Seize evidence connected to criminal activity. Conduct investigations. Interview victims, witnesses, and others. Gather physical evidence. Conduct surveillance operations. Acquire and run confidential informants. Utilize plainclothes officers. Utilize undercover officers. Target criminal street gangs. Target the street money of gangs. You'll notice this one has a question mark for public law enforcement. That's because while I made this a cornerstone of our work, specifically targeting their drug and prostitution operations, very few law enforcement agencies had any program in place that focused on diminishing the gang's resources by cutting off their street revenue. That was an approach I came up with, and combined with other measures, it was very successful at reducing gang activities in the area we worked. Target known violent criminals. Build cases prosecutors can prove beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the standard for a jury conviction. You'll notice, again, there is a question mark for public law enforcement. Most cops simply obtain information or evidence sufficient to establish probable cause, which is the minimum standard to make a legal arrest. That never made much sense to me. If the person committed a crime, then I should be able to provide enough evidence to the prosecutor to secure a conviction, not merely the minimum to make an arrest. Now let's take a look at some of the areas in which the graphic is going to change a bit. Removing a child from parents. Although I put a red X in the private law enforcement column, it should probably be a question mark. We could arrest the parent or parents for abuse, neglect, or endangerment based on the particulars of the case, and then contact Child Protective Services. But it was generally faster simply to call the local police agency and let them contact CPS. That also freed our officers to get back on the street. Seize a person for 72 hours psych evaluation. This is exclusively the domain of the public agencies, as it should be. When we encountered a person we believed to be a danger to himself or others, we called in our partners in public law enforcement and shared the appropriate information with them. Qualified immunity from damages in civil lawsuit. More on this very important subject in part 3. If you're still with me, this is probably a good time for me to tell you that the footage of law enforcement officers you watched before we jumped into part 1 wasn't public law enforcement officers. It was me and my officers. If you could not tell the difference, that should probably be an eye-opener for you. Learning and understanding applicable laws. Report writing. Applying the force continuum. Firearms training and standards. Baton training and standards. Pepper spray training. Tasers didn't hit the law enforcement community until 2000, so they're not addressed here. Suspect control techniques. Handcuffing skills, because it's easy when they cooperate, much harder when they're fighting. De-escalation training. There's a question mark under public law enforcement because very few agencies provided this training to their officers in the 90s. We did for reasons that would become clear in just a few minutes. Respecting citizens' rights. There's a question mark under public law enforcement because public law enforcement mostly sees the limits placed on their actions by constitutional provisions as disagreeable obstacles to getting their job done, and often look for ways around those rights. If you've ever seen video of public law enforcement officers discussing how they manufacture reasonable suspicion or probable cause after they got caught acting without it, you know what I mean. My officers and I saw preserving your rights as a duty to our fellow citizens. Ongoing field training, field interview skills, interrogation skills, creating confidential informants, EVOC, it was simply called pursuit driving back in the 90s, officer safety skills, emergency medical skills. This part could go on for a long time, so I'll stop here. I'm sure you get the point. When necessary, my officers would conduct days of surveillance in order to obtain enough evidence to make arrests and ensure convictions. That didn't always make us popular. On one occasion, we arrested a drug dealer named Big Frank. Big Frank had been a fixture in the neighborhood for years, and everyone knew who he was and what he did. When we came into the area, it took us about 90 days to arrest him for drug dealing. Because of our considerable surveillance time with key parts on video, we were also able to arrest his runners and lookouts as co-conspirators. At the next community policing meeting, which we always attended when we were working an area, a resident stood up and wanted to know why the public police hadn't taken down Big Frank in years, and we did it in a couple of months. In other similar circumstances, more politically savvy police management would praise such an arrest and tell the residents that we were all working closely together as a team to achieve these kind of successes, and we'd continue to do so moving forward. In that way, the public agency was able to appropriate for itself a bit of credit for our work, and that was fine with me. But the captain there that night wasn't that type. He got defensive and tried to make excuses for why his agency had failed to arrest Big Frank for years. And that didn't go over very well with the audience. Things got pretty ugly. The meeting ended shortly thereafter, and the captain stormed out without speaking to me. That agency, one of the largest in Southern California, is often featured in movies and television shows, and sometimes has an inflated perception of itself, at least it did back in those days. Instead of appreciating that we were removing dangerous criminals from the community we both served, police management in that area became resentful. I should take a moment to say that sort of reaction was rare. Most of the agencies quickly learned to appreciate our work because they recognized our high standards and quality work. And that gave them the ability to reallocate their own resources to better serve their citizens. The resentment of management in that area came to light again several months later in an unusual manner. I was at a dinner party, and one of the other guests to whom I was introduced was a Superior Court judge. When we were introduced, the judge remarked, "Your reputation precedes you, Mr. Champion." Later in the evening, we had an opportunity to speak privately. She told me that she knew who I was because the city attorney's office had approached her off the record to inquire what support the city could expect if it tried to limit our operations through the courts. She told me that after discussing the matter at some length with the attorney for the city, she realized the city's motivation was embarrassment and resentment by some of the city's police management. Our conversation ended with the judge encouraging me to, and I quote, "keep up the good work." The agency we've been discussing is very large with more than 9,000 officers. So how is our relationship with them on the street level? Two quick stories to illustrate that. One day I received a call from a homicide detective I knew casually. He told me he had an arrest warrant for a person suspected of attempted murder of a police officer and asked if we would serve the warrant. He explained this unusual request by saying that the suspect lived in an area we'd worked intensely for some time, and so it was best for my people to perform the warrant service. Okay. The next morning, I led a team of my officers in a Don SWAT-style entry of the suspect's home, and we took the suspect into custody without incident. Patrol officers from the public agency provided perimeter security for our operation. Several days later, in a private conversation, the detective let me know the real reason for asking us to perform the entry. He said he had concerns that if he had asked his own agency's SWAT team to serve the arrest warrant, the suspect would not have lived to stand trial. And he was right to have that concern. Several months earlier, at a barbecue, one of that agency's SWAT gods had more to drink than he should have. He told me that a number of incidents he had been ordered by top brass, his words, that the suspect was not to come out alive, and he had followed those orders. The detective had come to me to serve the arrest warrant because our reputation was such that he knew we were professionals, we obeyed the law at all times, and never took a suspect's life unless the suspect made that necessary. In another incident, my partner and I responded to a child endangerment call. When we arrived, we found two children, one about a year old and the other perhaps about 2, alone in an apartment. There was no furniture in the apartment. The children were crawling on the carpet that was covered in human feces. And because the power had been turned off, there were lit candles on the floor with the children. An informant notified us the mother was in another apartment getting high. We called the public police agency in order to get Child Protective Services involved quickly. 2 officers showed up. One was about 6'7" and the other 5'7". My partner and the taller officer went to arrest the mother. The officer who remained with me was a former Navy SEAL who hailed from Tennessee. When he left the Navy, he decided to join a well-known big city police department, which is how we ended up there together that night. As he and I were talking, he mentioned the instructions on the data terminal in his car said that no one from his agency was to enter that property without 10 officers and a supervisor. That reflected how dangerous his agency perceived that location to be. Recognizing that such a restriction was not a mere suggestion and violating it could bring disciplinary action, I asked why he and his partner were there without 8 other officers and a supervisor. In his pronounced southern drawl, he told me, "We're a lot safer with 2 of y'all than with 9 more of officers from our department." I told you at the beginning I was going to share with you the reason that private law enforcement must perform to a much higher standard of compliance with the law and respect for individual rights than do public officers. I'm going to explain it right now. Public officers enjoy something called qualified immunity. Qualified immunity generally protects public officers from being held personally liable for a claim of damages in civil suit. It is qualified because it's not absolute. If an officer's actions are extreme, then a court may waive the immunity. But so how does that play out in the real world? In the real world, it is virtually impossible to sue an officer personally. Courts uphold immunity for virtually any reason. An officer saying his agency didn't train him on something a 12-year-old would know from common sense. Immunity upheld. The officer had violated people's rights in that same way on numerous previous occasions in the presence of a supervisor and wasn't disciplined. Immunity upheld. The officer received training in a particular area, but argues before the court that it didn't address this specific situation. Immunity upheld. In other words, it's a cold day in hell when a court removes an officer's immunity. And because public officers know this, they know they can violate people's rights with virtual impunity from any personal liability. It should then be no surprise that many officers do exactly that, knowing that while the taxpayers will get saddled with a money judgment for the officer's misconduct, the officer himself is immune. We've had many such cases involving Nye County deputies. By contrast, private law enforcement has no immunity whatsoever from personal liability for their actions on the job. 0. That means the conduct of private law enforcement officers must be virtually flawless. A private law enforcement officer must be able to defend his actions on the merits of the situation or face potential financial ruin. How precise would you feel you needed to be at your job if you knew that a single mistake could cost tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars to you? My officers and I live with that reality every night when we hit the streets. When you face that sort of personal consequence for your actions, you perform to an infinitely higher level of expertise and professionalism than is required of public officers. One might think that would result in officers being more docile, less productive. But as we've already covered, it was exactly the opposite. Our productivity was so high that management of one public agency became embarrassed and resentful. And not only was the productivity high, but the quality of the work was so thorough that never once did a DA have to offer a defendant a plea bargain because the evidence wouldn't support proof beyond a reasonable doubt. I was very proud of my officers for that back then. I still am. Excellence is something of which to be proud. We've covered a lot of ground, so where does that leave us? I said at the beginning that I never tell anyone what to think. That isn't my place. I provide the information and you're the judge. Many years ago, the United States Supreme Court said that we must look at the substance of a thing, not the mere form. In other words, looking at what is really taking place is the proper criteria for evaluation, not superficialities like titles or a certificate hanging on the wall. Each night when we hit the street, did my officers and I perform what could best be described as police work? I believe it's obvious we did. We did the same exact job as public officers, simply without the perks of doing it for government, such as qualified immunity. Why do some folks dwell on things like a post certificate? Well, it's hard to say, but let's keep in mind that police training is neither extensive nor particularly challenging. In many states, the training required to be a beautician is almost 5 times as long as to be a cop. We should also remember that some departments reject higher scoring applicants and hire only those with lower scores on the test. We know this because an applicant sued over that approach and the court said there was nothing wrong with it. Clearly, if an academy required high intelligence, no department would offer candidates with lower scores. And of course, here in Nye County, NCSO just ran a no-fail academy, followed by no-fail field training. In other words, some candidates who would have failed anywhere else were passed along to become deputies in our community. When that deputy reaches 365 days in this no-fail environment, he'll receive his post certificate. Now, tell me again how significant a post certificate is? I find the notion that you have to have a government certificate to do a thing, or do it well, kind of kooky. In our system of government, we the people, you and I, are the power. Every power government has, it gets from us. We delegate our power to government. So how could government agents, that we call police, have the power to enforce law if the power isn't ours in the first place? And remember, just because most Americans choose not to exercise that power doesn't mean we don't have it. We do. We always have, and we always will. Thank you for watching. I look forward to your vote.